Today on Stronger Than Reason, we revisit the most recent album by the Sisters of Mercy, 1990's Vision Thing. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So let's think back to the fall of 1990. So in the U.S., we were in the second year of George Herbert Walker Bush's administration. Iraq had invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, to much international condemnation. In fact, later that day, the United Nations adopted Security Council Resolution 660, calling for Iraq's immediate withdrawal. By the fall, the U.S. had begun Operation Desert Shield, building up forces in Saudi Arabia. Now, apart from demanding justice for Kuwait, we were also obviously defending our own interests. If Iraq had seized Saudi oil fields, they would have controlled the vast majority of the world's oil reserves, and old George wasn't having that. So, for some perspective, the average price of a gallon of gas in the U.S. in 1990 was... Any guesses? Any guesses? So the answer is $1.30. But before you start pining for the days of such inexpensive gas, keep in mind that $1.30 in 1990 is equivalent to $3.13 today, which, coincidentally, is precisely what GasBuddy.com tells me is the current 18-month average price. So, the real cost of gas effectively hasn't changed in 34 years. The number has just gotten bigger. And do we have the Gulf War to thank for that? Maybe. If you don't factor in the total cost of the war, which is estimated to be some $8 billion paid for by U.S. tax dollars, plus some $52 billion paid for by other nations, not to mention the human capital, tens of thousands of Kuwaiti and Iraqi deaths. The exact numbers fluctuate depending on who's doing the telling. And of course, 148 U.S. troops killed, one of whom was from my hometown. I was friends with his son. But hey, gas was and is cheap, and for real, the justice for Kuwait was priceless, if largely a side effect of securing that oil. Meanwhile, at home, my friends and I were turning 18 and registering for selective service, otherwise known as the military draft, and wondering whether these developments halfway around the world would impact our plans. Many of us were looking at colleges, getting our applications together. Would there be another draft? Would we get called up? Would Iraq turn into another Vietnam, chewing up American kids? I remember my dad saying it was unlikely due to the simple fact that the desert wasn't the jungle. There just wasn't anywhere to hide, and that made perfect sense to me. So, I carried on with my life, confident that coalition military forces would quickly sort Saddam out, which of course turned out to largely be the case. But, it's hard to remember the attitudes from way back then in the early 90s because we had so much war since then, but we hadn't then. I can remember 9/11, of course, and what I was doing on that day. And I remember the day Bush Jr. invaded Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001, almost exactly 23 years ago. Little did we know that that war would drag on for 19 years. And in the midst of it, he'd also find time to finish the job in Iraq with a ginned-up war that was more about wounded pride than anything else. About Bush Jr. doing what his father couldn't, getting revenge on Saddam Hussein. And of course, we know now that it was predicated on lies about non-existent weapons of mass destruction. So, almost 2 decades of continuous American war fighting on multiple fronts, but in 1990, none of that had yet happened. The U.S. hadn't been engaged in a long-term conflict since leaving Vietnam in 1973. So practically, my whole life had been peaceful. So in 1990, the prospect of potentially entering into another true war was daunting. And that prospect affected the culture as well, which makes sense since the culture reflects the prevailing attitudes and concerns of the day. Celebrities, press, musicians, anyone with a platform was chiming in on the potential war. And of course, this extended to MTV, even to 120 Minutes, the weekly alternative show which by then I was watching religiously, recording it every weekend on my VCR, onto this tape, as a matter of fact. I really regret getting rid of my VCR. I should probably pick up another one of these days. But yeah, on one Saturday night in the late fall, the host Dave Kendall was joined by none other than Andrew Eldritch, frontman for the English rock band The Sisters of Mercy, who took that opportunity to express his support for Kuwait and trepidation about the USA going about its liberation alone. And I thought it was interesting to hear an entertainer just not express an immediate, knee-jerk anti-war reaction. But then I would later learn that Mr. Eldritch was an intelligent person who was never really shy about speaking his mind. See, the Sisters' second album, Floodland, was a favorite of mine. It had been released in 1987, but, I hadn't found it until much later. It was a masterpiece of high production values produced by Jim Steinman, who was the guy famous for big operatic rock numbers by the likes of Bonnie Tyler and Meatloaf. Floodland was an over-the-top affair, and that's why I loved it. You might recall that I talked much more about it way back in episode 10, before I had a proper microphone or knew what the heck I was doing. Sorry about the crap audio. But great music was popping up left and right in 1990, and I remember going into the mall and walking into National Record Mart right around this time, the fall of 1990, only to see a brand new album by the Sisters of Mercy, and none of my friends had it yet, so I snapped it up immediately. And of course, back then I was only collecting cassettes. I wouldn't get my first CD player for a couple of years. So much like Horse Rotorvator from the previous episode, I only have this album on cassette, and here it is, their third, and as of press time, most recent studio album, Vision Thing. I immediately knew that there would be something political about this record just from the title, since Vision Thing was a phrase attributed to Bush Sr. It was a term he coined leading up to the 1988 election, when he was describing his difficulty in coming up with an overarching theme for his presidency. So to get elected, he realized he would have to articulate a vision. So yeah, that vision thing was haunting him. Fortunately for him, his opponent, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, made the horrific mistake of appearing in a photo wearing a funny hat, which, needless to say, rendered him completely unfit for office, and Bush Sr. won the election handily. Gosh, remember those days when a funny hat would disqualify you? I miss those days, frankly. I miss them a lot. Regardless, I picked up Vision Thing with some trepidation, because would it be chock full of no blood for oil anthems, or would it be the goth rock equivalent of Give Peace a Chance? So I took it home and pressed play, half expecting Floodland Part 2, bombastic string sections, soaring operatic backup vocals, buttery synth leads, and enough gated reverb to make the drums sound like cannon shots. And what I found was different. Not bad, but just different. Because Vision Thing was largely a rock album, and it's clear most of the songs were written by guitarists, much like the Sisters' first album, First and Last and Always, which we have yet to discuss. Though First and Last and Always suffers a bit, in my opinion, from dodgy production, and Vision Thing, of course, does not. In fact, Jim Steinman makes another appearance here for just one song, the big hit single, More, which is indeed pretty epic. But we'll get into that on the track by track. But first, who were the Sisters in 1990? Now, you might recall that as a band, they had a history of heavy turnover. Their first lineup, which featured Eldritch with guitarists Gary Marks and Wayne Hussey and bassist Craig Adams, recorded the first album and another album's worth of singles. And as I discussed in episode 10, everyone but Eldritch would then split off to form another band called The Mission, making Floodland then a mostly solo affair, with just Eldritch and Steinman in the studio, accompanied by Patricia Morrison, the former bassist for the Gun Club, who it turns out may or may not have actually played on the record. So the sisters did not tour to support Floodland, preferring instead to focus on high production value videos and miming on TV. But the album was very successful, climbing to number 9 in the UK albums chart and hitting number 101 on the US Billboard. The videos from Floodland were very stylish and certainly a cut above typical MTV fare, so they propelled the band to some alternative fame. And eventually Eldritch had some sort of falling out with Patricia Morrison and found himself again wanting to make another album. Imagine that, but once again having no band. So he needed some teammates stat. So first he reached out to John Perry, who was the guitarist for the English band The Only Ones. And Perry didn't want to be a full-time member, but he did contribute some tasty guitar licks to the album, as we'll see. So Eldritch then pinged his label East West to see if they had any ideas. They floated a demo tape sent in by a young and hitherto unknown Hamburg guitarist, Andreas Brun. Eldritch got into contact, went to Brun's flat to conduct an audition, much to the astonishment of Brun's roommates, and hired him. So the work on the next album began in earnest. Soon Eldritch would bring in bassist Tony James, formerly of Generation X, and maybe more infamously, Sig Sputnik. Finally, he rounded out the team by bringing in Tim Brasheno, who is best known for playing guitar in the band All About Eve, though by later accounts, neither James nor Brasheno contributed much in the way of recording. Oh, and I should mention the band's final member, of course, Dr. Avalanche, who I thought was a real dude with a silly nickname until I realized it was a drum machine with a silly nickname. And judging from the sisters' very ancient website, the Doctor around the time of Vision Thing was most likely a 386 PC, which of course was an upgrade from the 286 used to record Floodland. So let's take a closer look at this album. It came out in October of 1990, and it has just 8 tracks, though it was preceded by a single for More, the one produced by Jim Steinman, and 2 more singles would follow from this album. But strangely, there was a dearth of material. By all accounts, the new lineup had a hard time coming up with ideas, leading to some consternation from management and the label. Eventually, there would be 9 original songs, 8 on the album, 1 B-side, and a bevy of filler in the way of remixes and live cuts. Such was the state of things in the digitized early 90s, when derivative content could easily be 25 to 75% of a band's output. Could be worse, some bands really only had 1 or 2 songs that were just endlessly repackaged. The art of noise. But let's talk about the art here, which I will blow up so we can actually see it. So obviously we have the Eye of Horus, as designed by Andrew Eldritch and Tony James, and tweaked by the design studio Stylo Rouge. Andrew says that the very subtle black modeling in the background is actually a photo of inner city Detroit. I don't see it myself, but who am I to question this guy and his own art choices? No one, that's who. So there's not a tremendous amount of packaging with this record, a couple trippy photos of the band, and as ever, a lyric sheet. On 120 Minutes, Eldritch did describe the album as confident and arrogant without any sort of victimhood about it. And I think that makes sense. The attitude sets it slightly apart from their earlier work, which was, sometimes emo-ish. I'm thinking of 1959 here, for instance. But let's get to the tea, as the kids say. Is this a goth record? After all, Eldritch is revered as a patron saint of dark culture, and he's well known for bucking against the goth label. But at the same time, he routinely books the band to headline Mara Luna, so, it's a bit of a half-hearted denial. And I would say, really, no, this album isn't goth at all. It's definitely got more of an uplifting rock vibe to it. I think it focuses on traditional rock instrumentation and voicings. Not a lot of, harpsichords and lutes and operatic vocals here, though in this period the band did continue to largely dress all in black, which is something that would certainly change in future lineups. But overall, this is a short album. It's just 42 minutes, 35 seconds. Its 8 tracks were very hard won. So let's dip into them now. The first track is the title track, Vision Thing. And right away, it was clear to me that this album was not mimicking Floodland, because this is just a straight up rock song. And if the guitars weren't enough to convince you of that, the lyrics certainly were, with references to whores and blow, and with Andrew dropping F-bombs like Scud missiles. And probably it's the reason why they skipped this as a single, because the prospects of radio play in 1990 were just about nil. Clearly, though, this was not the Sisters of 1987. I would say that this Vision Thing is a mildly political song overall. It certainly would not reach the level of political animus that Ministry would hit a decade later with Al Jorgensen's Bush Jr. trilogy. Somehow, Al always makes his best stuff during Republican administrations. I just can't figure it out. But Vision Thing still is a bit of a political tune, and it's a very pop one at that. Unlike the longer vamps and suites and interludes of Floodland, this album veers away from progressive arrangements and is really more of a collection of radio-friendly pop songs, with maybe one exception, which we'll talk about shortly. I think that fact reflects the personalities involved and how all of these songs started life in the hands of a guitarist, not some mouse bender sitting in front of a computer. As a rock song, Vision Thing is pretty standard stuff. I don't think it would sound very out of place on a 90s rock radio station. It's power pop, with nary a synth to be found, and I gotta admit, listening to it for the first time, I was a wee bit disappointed. I was kind of hoping for big Floodland-ish production values here, only to find this tune more in line with classic rock, but fine. I think it's a good lead-off track. I think it is pretty well representative of the album. So with maybe some trepidation, I moved on to track 2, which was Ribbons. Now, this is maybe the most interesting song here, maybe the least pop-oriented. It's got some darker, more menacing instrumentation. It sounds like it's got a lot of 12-string guitar to my ear. Mostly, though, I'm taken by Eldritch's vocals. He's practically feral here, growling and spitting like a rabid walrus, particularly at the end with his repeated shouts of, "Incoming!" One of which comes well after the end of the song as a bit of a fun surprise for anyone not really paying attention. But I think Ribbons is a great track overall. I think it's demonstrating a bit of a Vision Thing beyond the formulaic alt-rock of the moment. And then on to track 3, which was Detonation Boulevard. Again, some pretty standard upbeat major key rock here, with an added touch of some great slide guitar from John Perry. That was his contribution to the album. That was it. And this song also has a few keyboard embellishments here and there, but this is largely power trio stuff. It's very pop. It's very verse, chorus, verse. It's very catchy. And, no complaints from me, but if you're looking for layers of production and deep meaning, you're not going to find it here. So this kind of song really harkens back to the Sisters' first album, not their second. But they did do a video for this song, Detonation Boulevard. However, there was no corresponding single. And the video is smoke-filled, grainy. It's all in black and white. It's very much in the mode of Anton Corbijn, which, like an onion on the belt, was the style at the time. We didn't have color video because of the war. Anyway, so we wrap up side A with a slower number, which is ironically called Something Fast. It is not fast. It is slow. And it is one of 2 acoustic ballads here. It might be my least favorite song on this album overall, because I think it's got a somewhat annoying sing-along chorus, although that chorus does have some good wordplay that draws a line between hailing taxis with that ever-popular Catholic prayer, the Hail Mary. That said, it kind of devolves into a football anthem by the end, which is not really my thing, But there you go. That was side A. Side B, oh, I just noticed they call it side 1 and side 2. So, pardon me. Side 2 starts out strong with When You Don't See Me, which is another rockin' stomper. What can I say? But somehow this one is my favorite of the bunch. Why? I don't know. I like the lyrics. I like the dynamics, louder choruses, quiet verses. I like that it has a bit of a bridge. I don't know. I just like this song. I always have. I can't really explain it. It was the third single. That single has just 3 tracks. It has a remix, it has a live version of Ribbons, and it has a live version of Something Fast. I do not own this single. I have never heard it, though I'm thinking I should probably check it out since I do like this song. This is kind of the opposite situation we had with Detonation Boulevard, because here we have a single with no video. Go figure. Next up, Dr. Jeep. This song is pretty much a guitar riff that just goes on and on without break for almost 5 minutes. Fortunately, it's a very good guitar riff, and I do like this song. I think it's ridiculously catchy with its non sequitur lyrics. I find myself singing this song all the time for the last, however many years, 30 plus years I've been singing this song randomly. This was also a single with no video. The single has 3 tracks, a radio edit, an extended mix, and a live cover of Bob Dylan's Knockin' on Heaven's Door. So what is Dr. Jeep talking about? If I had to guess, I'd say it was juxtaposing violent world affairs with the inanity of consumer culture, much in the vein of the best songs by the Dead Kennedys. In fact, I'd pay good money to hear Jello Biafra give this song a go. I think it would be a good fit for him. Track 7 is the big single, More, which came out a few weeks ahead of the album. I did not buy the single, though a good friend of mine did. I remember the night he bought it. It was one cold evening, and we had gone to the mall, and then we drove to some girl's house to play it on her sound system. I don't recall her being tremendously impressed with it, but I liked it, maybe because More is very Floodland-esque, because Eldritch brought Jim Steinman out of Cold Pack to produce it. But instead of Wagnerian choirs, this tune has a lot of brooding synth and piano riffs, and sure enough, like the rest of the album, it eventually brings the rock, as you knew it would. Another nice touch here are the Soul Mama vocals provided by the Scottish singer Maggie Riley, who maybe was best known for her collaborations with Mike Oldfield, an artist, I have to say, with whom I'm not tremendously familiar. But Maggie is great on this track for sure. This single had 3 tracks once again. It had the original version, an extended version, and the only real B-side in this whole mess, a tune called You Could Be the One. And I know this is going to come as a complete shock, but to my ear, this is another pretty standard rock song, except there is one really good bit in the chorus because it's got yeah, yeah, yeahs that pretty much beg for the old one-arm fist pump. This was no doubt a high point to their show in the early 90s. The video for More is pretty much what you'd expect, just the band in full live performance mode, lots of leather, blowing hair, scantily clad women, sunglasses, so yeah. More did do well on the charts. It hit number 14 in the UK and number 1 on Billboard's Alternative Airplay. And I do remember seeing it pretty regularly on 120 Minutes, if not on ordinary vanilla MTV. But then I rarely watched ordinary vanilla MTV, so who knows? Finally, we round out the side with the final track, I Was Wrong, and this is another simple acoustic guitar ballad. It's got some nice bass work. I kind of wonder whether it was Tony James or someone else, hard to say. But I do love this song, maybe for its simplicity, its stark lack of production compared to More, which I think is really overblown. To me, this song is pretty in the way that 1959 was. I think it serves a similar niche here. And I think the last bit of the chorus is very clever when he says, I can love my fellow man, but I'm damned if I'll love yours. So as we say, that's pretty cold-blooded. Altogether, I think this song is a nice encapsulation of early morning regret, that feeling of knowing that you should have known better, but that you just couldn't help yourself. You know, we've all been there. And that's the album, just 8 songs, nice and tight. In this case, the padding was all on the singles, though I should point out that as with the prior Sisters albums, they reissued this one in 2006 and bundled all the B-sides on it, minus the Bob Dylan cover. So, why do I love it? Well, I did listen to this album pretty constantly for years. It's just one of those that's been burned into my consciousness. I can remember pretty much every moment, and I can play the songs back in my head at will. Again, if there were, I don't know, some kind of worldwide disaster, and we happen to lose every copy of Vision Thing by the Sisters of Mercy, I'm pretty sure that I could recreate it, at least the gist of it. But of course, if such a crisis happened, recreating this album would probably be the least of my problems. What can I say? It's a somewhat trite rock album, only alternative in the sense that the band wasn't recognized by the mainstream, but not alternative in the sense of the music's composition or presentation, because any of this stuff, I'm sure, would have fit squarely into what I remember of 90s rock radio, alongside Shake Your Moneymaker by the Black Crowes and Charmed Life by Billy Idol. So, you know, to me, it conjures up feelings of cold weather, of driving around endlessly with my friends, hiding in my room with the stereo blasting. You know, I find Vision Thing to be a pretty uplifting album when I listen to it. I think it's very unlike what I'd expect from so-called goth music, and I agree with Andrew Eldritch that it sounds confident. And who knows, maybe it gave me some much-needed confidence at that time in my life, when there was a bit more uncertainty than usual, when I was planning to move on to the next thing one way or another, either heading off to school or getting sucked into some kind of meat grinder a la Vietnam. Fortunately, it was the former, and this record is part of my soundtrack to that time, and that's why I love it. So what happened next? Well, the band toured over the next 2 or 3 years. The lineup changed bit by bit, as it seemed to constantly do, and in time, Tony, Tim, and Andreas would go on to other things, and Andrew would bring in Adam Pearson, who would be the first in a long line of guitar slingers to spend time in the band. And as we know, the Sisters gradually morphed from a standard sort of musical act that alternated recording and touring into an act that toured only, which is not to say that they didn't continue writing new material. To this day, they've written a few albums worth of new stuff. They just aren't recording it. And that fact used to frustrate me because I didn't have a ton of opportunities to go see this band live. So for years, I can only really experience them through their recorded material, at least until YouTube became a thing. And I thought that not having any new music from them in the form of albums was kind of a drag. It seemed silly and counterproductive to growing a fan base. But I think I get it now. The rise of Napster and file sharing in the early 2000s really torpedoed the value of recorded music. And the streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music, who, in full disclosure, host this podcast, have long since put the nail in that coffin. So in what is left of the music industry today, records are simply loss leaders, like gas at your local convenience store. If you're a professional musician, unless you're in the top wee bit of acts, you're not making money on records. You're either not making money at all, or you're making some money touring, with people actually buying tickets to see you perform. Records are really only important in the sense that they're merch, like t-shirts. So maybe Andrew figured that out long ago, that the age of the recorded tune was over, so there was no point slogging into a studio and paying a producer to craft your masterpieces, just for file sharers and streaming companies to steal them from you. So instead, he focused on the most essential bit of the business, the moneymaker, playing live. So who can blame him? After all, he sidestepped all the downsides to having a label that just wants you to churn out an endless supply of product. And so by focusing on the live aspect, he's essentially making a statement that music is perhaps a living thing, that there's no point in trying to capture a platonic ideal of a song, because those things are just mere snapshots. Songs constantly evolve and morph over time. There is no objective truth. There is no fixed canon. It's just like music is some kind of, I don't know, like a revered George Lucas movie. It's just subject to eternal editing. Or maybe Andrew's just a lazy bastard who can't be bothered to step into a studio. I don't know. Don't listen to me. I'm just a guy on the internet. Anyway, the sisters would release a few more tracks after Vision Thing, namely 2 new tracks for their 1992 best of, A Slight Case of Overbombing, one of which would be their final single, a pretty outstanding track in my opinion, called Under the Gun, featuring vocals by Berlin's Terry Nunn. The other was a re-recording of their 1983 goth night staple, Temple of Love, featuring Israeli singer Afra Haza on backup vocals. And that would be it. They haven't officially released a single note of music since August 16th, 1993, a little over 31 years ago. So where are they now? Well, they're still touring, naturally. They just passed through the Northeast U.S. not long ago, although I only got to see them through the wonders of YouTube, alas. Though I have to say that they appeared to give a much better show than last year when Andrew seemed to have completely lost his voice. I don't know what was up with that, but I'm happy to see him back in fine form. Well, there you have it, folks. The Sisters of Mercy's Vision Thing, an alternate title for which may as well be Third and Last and Always, at least for now. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, the show that wants to ask you an important question. What's green and fuzzy and can kill you if it falls out of a tree? That's right, a pool table. Very good, very good. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay strong.